I recently got the opportunity to light and shoot an interview with former Vikings coach Mike Tice. And I want to break it down today and talk about the approach, some keys to success, some things that work, some challenges, all that good stuff. And as always, I don't want to waste any more time, so let's hop into the footage. So in terms of camera and lenses, we have a set of Tokina Vistas in-house, which are awesome. They can be expressive if you want, they can flare pretty easily, but you can knock those flares down, stop it down, get something really clean and sharp. Just overall, a fantastic lens set. And I knew that I wanted something straight to camera, a little bit tight and more compressed. So I went with the 50mm on the Burano for the A angle. But when you're picking your lenses for an interview, if you have the cameras really close to one another, to avoid having a jump cut, the rule of thumb I live by is one lens should be at least 2x what the other focal length is. So in this case, with my wide being 50, my tight has to be 105 if they're gonna be right next to each other. This isn't as serious of a rule if you're gonna be off axis and more of a profile shot, and obviously it's based on the camera position. But in the event that because of the space and because of how we're gonna end up framing it for creative choices or whatever, if you do have to have the cameras really close to each other, to avoid that jump cut, rule of thumb I like is have one of the lenses be twice as long as the other focal length wise. So again, went with the 105 for the B angle. And then I decided to throw in a third camera because we're lucky enough to have the camera availability, but also I thought that I would get something a little bit moodier and a little bit more emotional. So for that, I threw the 50mm f1.8 from Sony that's got the autofocus in it on another FX6 and was gonna make that the more unique, more emotional, more non-traditional C angle. So taking a look at the first still, we shot this over at the Omni in Vikings Lakes. And in this space, I positioned the A angle with that intersection of the two walls behind the Talon's head, which creates depth, that L of the room. And frames it with leading lines. But the tricky part was there, like I said earlier, there are these massive windows. So I brought the shades down to control them a little bit. So I didn't want this overexposed area to be the entirety of the window. So we've got tops of trees, we have a little bit of that overexposed area, and then we have the shades, which I thought was a little bit more control, but also a little bit more interesting. Then there is a lamp that breaks up the white wall a little bit, but turned on. We didn't have a bulb with controllable temp, so I kept that off. I thought about having that as a practical, but the temperature was too warm and I didn't have a solve for that. But I did open up the blinds, a little bit of that sun through, and create a hot spot, indicating that there is a window there. So it makes sense that we're motivating the key from the window side. And then to light it, I had a 600X pushing in from that side, kind of wrapping around. The included diffusion was too dense. It's kind of like a knockoff Magic Cloth type of feel. And even at 100%, I couldn't get enough level. So I replaced that with draping an 8x of half grid over the front of the softbox, which is a little thinner and let more level through. But that ended up also giving me a nice, soft, flattering look, just a little bit less dense than the included diffusion. So that was just there to give me a little bit more level. And then where the light fell off on the shadow side, I wanted to have a slightly heavier contrast ratio. I metered it to exactly 2 stops under the key, and I did that by putting up an 8x of negative, again, just to stop the light from bouncing around the space and having a more aggressive fill side. I liked the contrast over there. I liked having a slightly heavier contrast ratio and thought that it looked nice. Then to add a little bit of separation, I threw an ADC and a Fresnel in the back right around the corner of the 8x of negative and shined that as a bit of an edge light. And as you can see, it's just kind of touching the backside of the cheek and kind of the ear area, but not wrapping around to the front and not reaching the nose. Edge lights can be particular, and in this case, I had the Fresnel and spotted it in a little bit too aggressively, so when Coach leaned forward, it kind of left that back of the head, and I wouldn't mind it if it were a little bit more open and doing a little bit more, but it does add a little bit of separation there, and that's kind of the objective of the edge light in a space like this, motivating the temperature from those windows in the background and separating the subject off the background. So taking a look at that B angle, the cameras did end up being a little bit stacked, but because the lens is 2 times what it was on the A, the 105 is a little bit more than 2 times the 50, it's not a jump cut, and you're able to cut between these two so that even though they're positioned close to each other, it's very clear that these are 2 different shots, 2 different frames, and again, that's not a law, that's just a rule of thumb that I like to live by, but it does, I think it works pretty well, and it avoids there being a jump cut when you're cutting between the 2 frames. Also, by being a little bit more on the shadow side in this angle, you can see what the edge light's doing, and it's just, like I said, giving a little separation. It's the same color temp as those back windows, so it makes sense in the space, and it's just working so that the fall off isn't as intense as we wrap around the side of the face. And finally, for the C angle, we opted for this negative space close-up where we're actually framing the subject in a little bit more of a dramatic, a little bit more of a moody sense, a little bit shallower, but like I said, it's the C angle, so it's a bailout option for the editor. It introduces something new, based on the story thematically. It's just an option for them to have, and I think this one plays really well. I also color graded these, so I thought I'd show my node tree for this. The first node takes us into the wide gamut intermediate, and then there's a little bit of denoise. My primaries, I handled exposure via a linear gamma, and I used the gain wheel. Contrast is a S curve, and then my white balance again is in a linear gamma and using the gain wheel. Then for my secondaries, I'm using saturation by using an HSV node and disabling channels 1 and 3. And then I'm qualifying the skin slightly and compressing it a little bit by, again, grabbing a qualifier and then using a compression effect. And then I'm not using any digital diffusion or any grain in these, but that's what that node 11 for the effects node is. So there's my node tree, and I'll show you guys the log, the 709, and the grade for the A angle. So here's the log, the 709, and the grade. For the B angle, the log, the 709, and the grade. And for the C angle, the log, the 709, and the grade. So that's how I went about lighting and shooting an interview with former Vikings coach Mike Tice in a somewhat challenging and bigger room with a couple problems to solve, but even with just a 600, a 300, in an ADC, we were able to accomplish this just by removing light, being particular about what we can and can't control in the space, and then framing that main hero angle accordingly. So hopefully that was helpful. I do want to talk about resolve and my node tree and my grading approach a little bit more on the channel looking forward, but I'm enjoying doing these interview breakdowns, and I'm shooting interviews all the time, so it's fun to just come in here, break it down, and talk about some of the things that worked and some of the things that I think I could do better. But anyway, hopefully that was helpful, and I will see you guys in the next one.